It was late one evening when it all began. A quiet evening, the kind where the air feels heavy with the promise of something unsaid, hanging just beyond the grasp of the ordinary world. The house was eerily still, save for the occasional creak of old floorboards and the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I had always considered the house to be a sanctuary, an old but well-kept Victorian with creaky stairs, windows that rattled in the wind, and a faint scent of wood polish that seemed to linger in the air no matter how many times I cleaned. But on that evening, something was different. Something in the air felt off, like the house itself was holding its breath. It had been months since I had moved into this place, having purchased it for its charm and peaceful seclusion, far from the bustle of the city. I'd been living here alone, enjoying the quiet, with only my thoughts for company. My friends and family warned me about the old stories tied to this house, whispers about it being haunted, tales of strange occurrences from previous occupants, and rumors of something darker that resided in the shadows. But I never believed in that sort of thing. I scoffed at those stories, dismissing them as nothing more than superstition, fuel for gossip. But now I wasn't so sure. It started with a whisper, soft, almost like a breeze, but it was unmistakably a voice. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a product of fatigue, or perhaps even a trick of the wind as it slipped through the cracks of the old windows. I had just gotten into bed, the lights dimming as I tried to drift off, when I heard it, a faint voice, barely audible but clear enough to make my skin prickle. It was as if someone was standing right next to my bed, whispering into my ear, yet no one was there. "Help me." That's all it said. Just those two words, and they sent a chill straight down my spine. My heart raced, and I froze, unable to move. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but the voice did not repeat itself. The room remained silent, save for the faint tick of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. After all, I was alone, and nothing strange had happened before. But the feeling lingered, something gnawing at the back of my mind, like a persistent thought that wouldn't leave. It wasn't just the voice. It was the feeling that had accompanied it, an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something had been watching me. I tried to push it aside, blaming it on the stress of work, but deep down I knew something was wrong. The next few days were quiet. The whispers didn't return, and I convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing. But then, one night, as I lay in bed once more, I felt it, an oppressive presence in the room. It was as if the air had thickened, growing heavier with each passing second. I opened my eyes, half expecting to see a shadowy figure standing at the foot of my bed, but there was nothing there. The room was dark, save for the soft glow of the streetlights filtering through the curtains. Then, it happened again. The voice returned, but this time it was louder, more insistent. It was no longer just a whisper. It was as if someone was speaking directly into my ear, their breath hot against my skin. "Help me, please!" My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up in bed, my eyes darting around the room. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. I glanced toward the door, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. I quickly got out of bed, my legs shaky, and turned on the light. The room flooded with brightness, but nothing seemed out of place. The air no longer felt oppressive, but the sense of dread lingered. I thought about leaving the house. I considered calling a friend, someone who could come over and reassure me that I wasn't losing my mind. But I stayed. For reasons I still don't fully understand, I stayed. The whispers didn't stop. They grew more frequent over the next few nights. At first, they were subtle, faint whispers just on the edge of hearing, but with each passing night they became clearer, more distinct. They were no longer confined to my bedroom. They followed me throughout the house. In the kitchen, I would hear them as I washed dishes. In the living room, I would hear the soft murmur of voices as I sat reading or watching TV. At first, I thought I was imagining things. But then came the night when the whispers became demands. "Come closer." That's what I heard, clear as day. It was a voice that was neither male nor female, but it had an edge to it, a coldness that sent a shiver through my spine. It wasn't a request, it was an order. And I could feel it deep within me, that it wanted me to obey. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I turned slowly toward the sound. The room was empty, just as it always was, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, something that had been hiding just out of sight, waiting. I couldn't bring myself to go any closer. Instead, I left the room, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? How could anyone? The next day, I decided to investigate. I needed to understand what was happening, to find out if there was some logical explanation for the voices and the strange, oppressive feeling in the house. I began by searching through old records of the house's previous owners. That's when I found it, the first mention of something truly unsettling. In an old newspaper clipping, there was a brief mention of the house's original owner, a woman named Evelyn Holloway. She had lived in the house for several years in the early 1900s, but her life ended under mysterious circumstances. The report claimed that she had died in her sleep, but neighbors and local historians had always believed that there was something more to her death. The rumors were vague, something about a tragedy, about a presence that had haunted the house long before Evelyn's time. The details were scarce, but there was one part of the story that stood out to me. A family member had mentioned hearing strange whispers in the house before Evelyn's death, voices that seemed to come from nowhere. I was stunned. The stories about the house being haunted weren't just rumors, they were based on something real. The whispers were not a figment of my imagination, they were tied to the history of the house, to the tragedy that had unfolded here long before I moved in. But what did they mean? And why were they happening now? That night, I decided to confront whatever was in the house. I knew I couldn't keep running from it. I had to know the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. I set up a camera in the living room, hoping to capture any strange activity. I made sure the house was as quiet as possible, even turning off my phone so I wouldn't be distracted. As the hours passed, the silence grew oppressive, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. I sat on the couch trying to steady my nerves, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It wasn't long before the whispers returned. At first, they were soft, just barely audible, but as I sat there in the dark, they grew louder. It was as though the voices were closing in on me, moving around the room, circling me like predators stalking their prey. The whispers were no longer asking for help. They were demanding something from me. "Come, closer." I froze. I could feel my heart in my throat, pounding violently as the room seemed to grow colder. The voice was coming from behind me, right in my ear. I turned slowly, half expecting to see something, a shadow, a figure, anything. But there was nothing. The room was empty, just as it had been before. But the whispers didn't stop. They continued, growing more frantic, more insistent. And that's when I heard the final whisper. "Let me out." I felt my blood run cold. That night, I could barely sleep. The haunting whispers replayed over and over in my mind, echoing through the silence like a broken record. "Let me out." The words lingered like a curse, crawling under my skin and into my very soul. I was consumed by a need to understand, to know what was happening. But the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like I was unraveling something far darker than I had ever imagined. It was as though the house had been waiting for me, for some unknown reason, to come and unlock its secrets. The next morning, I decided to explore the house further. The day before, I had found an old stack of letters and documents in the attic. They were yellowed with age, brittle and fragile to the touch. They spoke of the Holloway family's history in the house, but they were not the key. What I found next, hidden in the back of an old trunk, would change everything. It was a journal, leather-bound, its cover worn from years of neglect. The pages inside were scrawled with erratic handwriting, almost illegible in some places. I could tell the person who wrote it was in distress, trying to document something that, even then, seemed beyond their understanding. I started reading, the words blurring in front of my eyes as I got further into the entries. The first few pages were filled with mundane observations, entries about the house's upkeep, the weather, visitors to the property. But as I got deeper into the journal, the tone shifted. The writer, Evelyn Holloway herself, seemed to grow more frantic with each passing day. It started as a whisper, just a faint sound, almost like wind, but it spoke to me. I thought I was losing my mind, hearing things that weren't there. But then it began to call my name. The voices, they are growing louder. They are inside the walls. At night, I hear them in the hallway calling to me. They say they are trapped here. They say they need me. I fear that I am losing myself to them. As I read through the journal, I felt a sense of dread creep up my spine. Evelyn's words were chilling, and they mirrored the experiences I had been having. The whispers, the feeling of being watched, the growing pressure to follow their commands, it all felt so familiar, as if her nightmare had somehow bled into my own. She had heard the same whispers, and they had driven her to the edge of madness. I turned the page, my hands shaking. The next entry was even more disturbing. I found it, the door, hidden behind the bookshelf in the library. It was locked for so long, but tonight I managed to get it open. There is something behind it, something that I can't explain. I hear it moving, calling my name. It has been waiting for so long. The air in the room is thick, heavy with the smell of decay. I don't know what I have unleashed. The whispers have stopped, but I feel it. Whatever was locked away, it is no longer contained. It is free now, and it has my soul in its grip. The words sent a cold wave of terror over me. The door. The hidden door. That was it. The key. The whispers had been trying to tell me something all along. I wasn't just hearing voices. I was being guided toward something. Something that had been locked away in this house for generations. Something dark and ancient. My mind raced as I tried to process what I had just read. The door behind the bookshelf. I had never noticed anything out of the ordinary in the library, but the journal made it clear that something had been concealed there, hidden away from prying eyes. Evelyn had opened it, and whatever had been locked behind that door had escaped. That's when the whispers had started for her, and now they were starting for me. I knew I had to find that door. Without wasting another second, I raced downstairs to the library. The house was silent, but it felt charged, like the calm before a storm. The library was one of my favorite places in the house, its high bookshelves, the smell of old paper, the soft glow of the reading lamp. But today, it felt different. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, twisting around me as I walked across the room. I approached the bookshelf that Evelyn had mentioned in her journal. It stood against the far wall, a collection of old leather-bound books arranged neatly. My fingers trembled as I ran them over the spines, searching for any sign of a hidden mechanism. There was nothing obvious, no buttons or switches, just rows upon rows of books. I leaned in closer, inspecting the bookshelf more carefully. The air seemed to grow colder, and my breath misted in front of me as I ran my hands along the wood. Suddenly, I felt something, a subtle shift, a faint click. The bookshelf moved ever so slightly, as if it were a door in disguise. My heart raced as I pushed against the wood. It slid open, revealing a small, narrow passageway. I stepped into the dark corridor, my footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The air here was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew and decay filled my nostrils. The passageway was barely wide enough for me to move through, and the walls seemed to close in around me as I crept forward. I felt as though I was walking deeper into the belly of the house, into its very heart. At the end of the corridor there was a door, an old rusted metal door. Its surface was covered in strange symbols, symbols I didn't recognize. The whispers were louder now, more urgent, as if they were coming from beyond that door. I reached out a shaking hand to touch the handle, but just as my fingers brushed it, a cold gust of air slammed against my face. I recoiled, heart racing. For a moment I stood there, frozen in place. The voices were so close now. I could hear them clearly, their words like a chant, rising and falling in rhythm. Let me out, come closer. They were no longer whispers. They were demands, and I could feel the pressure, the weight of their presence bearing down on me, pushing me toward the door. I couldn't resist. With trembling hands, I turned the handle and pushed the door open. Beyond it was a small room, its walls lined with shelves covered in cobwebs. On the floor, a large stone circle had been carved into the ground, surrounded by faded symbols and markings. The air inside the room was thick and heavy, and I could feel the energy pulsating around me, as if the very fabric of reality had been warped by whatever lay within. And there, in the center of the room, was an altar. It was ancient, made of weathered stone, and upon it was a book, open and waiting. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded and barely legible. The whispers were louder now, growing desperate, as if the book itself were calling to me, beckoning me closer. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I touched the book. The moment I made contact, everything changed. The room seemed to spin, the walls warping and twisting as if reality itself was coming undone. A cold wind howled through the room, snuffing out the light and plunging me into complete darkness. The whispers crescendoed, rising to a deafening roar. I could hear something moving, something large and shifting just beyond my vision, but I couldn't see it. My heart pounded in my chest as a voice, deep and guttural, filled my mind. "Release me." The room was no longer just a room. It was a prison, and I had just opened the door. The room spun around me, its very essence warping as if I were caught in a vortex of pure darkness. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, and I could feel the weight of something heavy in the air, suffocating and oppressive. The whispers, no, the voices, became louder, more intense, their tone a mixture of anger, pain, and something far worse, hunger. It was as though the darkness itself had come alive, pushing in from all sides. The book in my hands felt hot, its pages trembling under my touch as if it were alive. I could hear it calling to me, its ancient words vibrating through my fingers, pulling me deeper into its grip. The stone altar beneath me began to hum with an energy I couldn't comprehend, vibrating with an intensity that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. "Release me," the voice whispered again, this time in a voice so deep, so primal, that I could feel it in the very marrow of my bones. It wasn't coming from any one place. It surrounded me, an entity, an ancient force that had been imprisoned here for untold years. I felt its cold breath against my skin, its presence wrapping around me like a shadow, suffocating me. I stumbled back, dropping the book in fear. But it didn't fall to the ground. Instead, it hovered, just inches above the altar, its pages flicking open to a new section. The symbols on the stone floor began to glow with an eerie, unnatural light, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. And then, I saw it. From the far corners of the room, something began to emerge, a shape, shrouded in darkness, impossibly tall and gaunt. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, and its form seemed to flicker in and out of existence, like a shadow that could not remain in one place. Its eyes, if you could call them eyes, were pits of endless blackness, voids that sucked in all light and hope. It didn't speak, but I could feel its presence like a cold, suffocating weight. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move as the entity slowly advanced toward me, its long fingers reaching out, brushing against the air. The whispers had become a cacophony, a chorus of countless voices pleading, screaming, whispering from every direction. And in the middle of it all, the entity's voice rang out clear as a bell. "You freed me," it growled, the words vibrating through the very fabric of reality. "Now you will join me." I tried to run, to move, but my legs wouldn't respond. My body was frozen in place, my mind trapped in a state of terror so absolute that I could barely think. I could feel the cold, icy fingers of the creature wrapping around me, pulling me closer to it. Its touch was like ice, crawling beneath my skin, seeping into my soul. The room, the house, everything began to fade, to dissolve around me. I was drowning in the darkness. But then, in the corner of my eye, something shifted. A light. A soft, flickering light growing brighter in the distance. It was almost like a memory, a long-forgotten piece of the past that I had somehow forgotten. I wasn't sure what it was or where it came from, but it felt like the only thing real in that moment. The entity paused, its gaze shifting toward the light, as if it could sense the disturbance. The light grew brighter still, and for the first time I felt a sense of strength return to me. My body began to move again, my legs trembling as I forced myself to turn away from the entity. The room was collapsing around me, the shadows shifting and stretching like living things. The whispers turned into screams, voices begging for release, for salvation. I stumbled backward, my hand reaching for the book that lay discarded on the altar. I didn't know why, but I knew I had to destroy it. I had to close this door, end whatever had been unleashed. With all the strength I could muster, I grabbed the book and slammed it shut. The moment it closed, a deafening silence fell over the room. The oppressive weight that had been pressing down on me disappeared, replaced by an eerie calm. The entity screeched, a sound that could have shattered glass, and I felt its presence receding, fading into the ether. The stone altar cracked, its glow fading into nothingness. The symbols on the floor that had once pulsed with energy faded to mere shadows. And then, just like that, everything was gone. The room was empty. The darkness lifted. I collapsed to the ground, my body trembling as if I had just escaped from the very depths of hell. My breath came in ragged gasps, my chest aching from the terror I had just endured. The house around me was silent, eerily quiet, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew it wasn't over. The house had changed. The air felt thinner now, lighter, as if the weight of the dark entity had lifted, but something lingered. The whispers had stopped, but I could still feel their presence, like a shadow that never fully left. The house was still haunted, not by the whispers, but by something far worse. The knowledge that there were things in this world beyond our comprehension, forces that lay in wait for the unwary. As I left that room, I knew one thing for certain. I would never be the same. I couldn't unsee what I had seen, couldn't forget the thing that had lurked in the dark, calling to me from the edges of reality. I had opened a door, one that should never have been opened, and I had barely escaped with my life. The house? It stands still, its creaky floorboards and rickety windows now more familiar, somehow less menacing. But deep down I know that the whispers have not fully gone away. They still linger beneath the surface, waiting for someone else, someone unsuspecting, to listen, to open the door. And when they do, the darkness will return. The whispers will return. And the cycle will begin again. Thank you for listening to my story. If you want to hear more scary stories, please like and subscribe to my channel.